The Architect of Ruin, How Agrippina Created Nero. Part 1, The Prophecy and the Blood. The night air over the bay is heavy, the kind that presses against the lungs and makes every breath feel like the start of a confession. Outside, the sea licks at the shore with the slow rhythm of something that has watched empires rise and fall and is unimpressed by both. Inside a small lamplit room, the darkness seems to crouch in the corners, driven back only by the glow of oil flames. She stands there, a young woman with eyes that have already seen too much. A child balanced on her arm, small and warm and soft, oblivious to the weight hanging over him. The man across from her is older, cloaked, the lines on his face carved by foreign suns and sleepless nights spent reading the silent script of the heavens. A Chaldean astrologer, a professional interpreter of fate, exotic but familiar in an empire that imported seers along with spices and silk. He has already drawn the chart, lines and angles scratched on wax, positions of planets like spear points fixed in the firmament. He knows the answer. That is why he has been quiet so long. Agrippina the Younger does not share his hesitation. Well, her voice breaks the silence at last, low and controlled. You have looked long enough. What do the stars say of him? The child shifts, a soft sound escaping his lips. He does not yet know his own name will one day terrify a city that calls itself eternal. The astrologer's fingers tighten on the tablet. In the shifting light, his eyes seem to darken, as though what he has seen has changed him. He will be emperor, the man says finally. Your son will rule Rome. Agrippina does not move. That part she expected. Destiny runs in her blood like iron. And, she asks, the man swallows. But he will. He will be the cause of your death. He does not speak it as a curse. He speaks it like a sentence already carried out. The air thickens. Somewhere outside, a wave shatters itself against rock. Agrippina looks down at the tiny face resting against her shoulder, the slight flutter of breath at the lips, the faint scent of milk. She does not look afraid. How? She asks. How will he do it? The astrologer shakes his head. The stars speak in outcomes, not methods. They give us endings, not the manner of execution. He will be emperor, and he will kill his mother. There is a moment in which any other woman might stagger. Any other woman might clutch the child tighter, might call the man a liar or a blasphemer, might spit at the heavens for their cruelty. But Agrippina is not any other woman. She was born into a family where love is a thin veneer stretched over fear, where trust is a luxury no one in her bloodline can afford. She lifts her chin. Her gaze does not turn away from the man, or the tablet, or the unseen mechanism of fate grinding beyond both. Then let him kill me, she says, each word as clear and sharp as a blade laid on marble. Let him kill me, provided he rules. The astrologer stares at her, stunned, as though she has casually accepted drowning in exchange for touching the surface of the sea. But Agrippina feels something like clarity settle in her chest. The bargain has been named. The price is fixed. A mother's life for an emperor. She presses a kiss to her son's head, not with tender softness, but with the gravity of an oath. If the gods have already written the ending, then what remains is to control the path that leads there. She will not cower before destiny. She will wrestle it, shape it, force it through the narrow corridor of her will. If she must die by her son's hand, he will be a hand that wears the purple. The lamps shiver in a sudden draft. The room seems to grow colder. Somewhere inside, in a place she will never entirely admit even to herself, a thin voice whispers of things that can go wrong, of monsters made in the name of glory. But Agrippina has learned since childhood that in Rome, fear is not a warning. It is a weakness. She smothers the whisper until even its echo is gone. Let him kill me, provided he rules. The rest is detail. She had been born into blood that glittered and bled with equal intensity. Long before she knew the meaning of empire, she had the lineage of it written into her very name. Julia Agrippina, also known as Agrippina the Younger, was born in 15 AD into the Julio-Claudian dynasty as the daughter of the celebrated general Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, and great-granddaughter of Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Germanicus, adopted by Emperor Tiberius and adored by army and people alike, was widely seen as the natural future ruler of Rome, before his sudden death in 19 AD in the eastern provinces, a death ancient writers later hinted may have involved poisoning and court intrigue. From the beginning, she was surrounded by the mythology of her own family. She grew up listening to stories of how Augustus had pacified a world with patience and steel, how her grandfather Agrippa had commanded at Actium, how her father had ridden with legions along the Rhine, cheered by men hardened by winter and war. These tales were not idle entertainment. They were expectation, sewn into her veins like threads of fire. But it was not the victories she remembered most fiercely. It was the deaths. Her father died when she was a child, far away in the east, in a place of strength drained by suspicion. Fever, they said. Poison, others whispered. She was too young to understand the details, but she understood the tone. Men did not look one another in the eye when they spoke of it. Her mother, Agrippina the Elder, blamed Tiberius, the emperor, her father-in-law. The atmosphere in the household went from dim mourning to smoldering rage. Agrippina learned, watching her mother, that even a woman born of imperial blood could be crushed when she accused the wrong man. Her mother's grief turned into defiance. Her defiance turned into exile. Her exile turned into a slow, engineered death. Agrippina the Elder was eventually banished by Tiberius to the island of Pandateria, and later Roman sources report that she died there by enforced starvation, a punishment that made clear how far imperial power could reach into even the most sacred family bonds. Her bones were left to the sea wind and the indifference of the regime. The message was clear to the young Agrippina. In Rome, there is no safety in virtue, no shield in rightful grievance. There is only power, and those who wield it, and those who imagine they are safe until the door closes and the last bowl of grain never arrives. She kept her resentment deep. Unlike her mother, she would not shout at the machine. She would learn to become part of it. Her brother Gaius, better known to history by the nickname Caligula, Little Boot, taught her another kind of lesson. As a child, she had watched him charm soldiers, riding on their shoulders in miniature boots, the beloved mascot of the legions that had followed their father. As a man raised to the purple by the exhausted hopes of Rome, he became something else entirely. Madness is too simple a word for what took root in him. It was not sudden, and it was not unformed. It was the rot of absolute power gnawing through whatever remained of the boy she had known. He made gods of himself and nightmares of others. He humiliated Senate and citizen alike with games that had no rules and punishments that had no proportion. Agrippina survived his reign the way a mouse survives in a house with a sick cat, by knowing when to freeze and when to run, when to bow, and when to stay invisible. But even invisibility could not hide her forever. To be of the blood that might rival him was to stand perpetually at the edge of a cliff, waiting for the push. During Caligula's rule, she herself was implicated in a possible succession plot and, around 39 AD, banished to a remote island, one of several prominent figures removed from the capital as his paranoia grew. In the end, it was not she who fell first. It was Caligula. The knives found him in a corridor, steel flashing where flattery had failed. In 41 AD, officers of the Praetorian Guard turned on the emperor they were sworn to protect, cutting him down and plunging Rome into another succession crisis. His blood soaked the floor of the palace he had thought impregnable. For a moment, chaos reigned. The Senate schemed to reclaim old powers. The palace staff scattered. The people held their breath, wondering if this was the end of the imperial dream or merely one more bloody chapter. In that swirling confusion, Agrippina was no heroine, no rebel leader. She was a target, the sister of the dead tyrant, a woman whose existence itself was a threat to whatever fragile order might replace him. She remained in exile as the center of power shifted. The Praetorian Guard, searching the palace, found a man hiding behind a curtain, a scholar, not a soldier, a middle-aged relative who had never expected the burden of rule. This was Tiberius Claudius, Agrippina's uncle, raised up as emperor by the very soldiers who had killed his nephew. For Agrippina, the news reached her like the first crack of light under a prison door. She found herself once again in the shadow of her mother's fate, banished from the center of power, surrounded not by marble but by the chill of expendability. She looked at the sea that lapped against her new prison and thought of the stories of hunger and grief, that had ended on another island. But Agrippina was not her mother. She listened to the memory of those old stories and rewrote them in the privacy of her mind. This would not be her end. It would be her pause. She watched the sky change over the water and learned patience. Empires did not fall and rise only once. They shifted constantly. Men died and new men replaced them, and each brought new vulnerabilities, new desires, new cracks in the armor of the state. Somewhere, fate was rearranging the board. All she had to do was survive until her move came. When word finally reached her that Caligula was dead and that the man chosen to replace him was her uncle Claudius, she understood instantly that the pause was over. Claudius was an unlikely emperor, stammering, scholarly, mocked for his limp and his hesitation. He had spent much of his life protected by his own perceived uselessness. No one thought to kill him because no one thought he mattered. Now he mattered more than any man alive. With Claudius's accession in 41 AD, Agrippina was gradually allowed to return from exile and re-enter Roman public life, at first as a widowed noblewoman and mother to a young boy, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, later to be renamed Nero. For Agrippina, the calculation was simple. An emperor who had never expected to rule was an emperor who might listen to a woman who knew the corridors of power better than he did. A man whose entire life had been overshadowed by more charismatic relatives might find comfort in a union that offered him both legitimacy and guidance. But she was not yet in a position to make that offer. She returned to Rome not as a queen, but as a survivor. She had her name. She had her son. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was still a child, but already his ancestry was a living argument. Through her, he carried the blood of Augustus, the aura of Germanicus. In a city that revered lineage almost as much as victory, that was a currency as strong as any legion. When she walked again through the streets of Rome, smelling the familiar blend of smoke, sweat, perfume, and the metallic tang of ambition, she did so with the careful humility of someone who knows the walls are listening. The forum still buzzed with arguments that would not matter in 10 years. The palaces still gleamed with marble that could not hide the stains on the carpets. At the heart of this new order was another woman, Valeria Messalina, wife of Claudius, empress in all but name, famous even in a city of decadence for her appetite. Messalina was younger, beautiful, capricious. She treated the palace as a playground and the world outside as a blur. Lovers, games, feasts that blurred day into night, each new thrill replaced by another, like flowers tossed aside before they had time to wilt. Rome gossiped about her excesses with equal parts disgust and fascination. Her bed was the stuff of rumor, her whims the terror of any man or woman unlucky enough to be the object of her fleeting obsession or sudden hatred. Agrippina watched her, and in Messalina she saw not a rival in cunning, but a weakness waiting for the right moment to collapse. Messalina spent her power as if it were inexhaustible. Agrippina stored every glance, every word, every misstep in a quiet ledger in her mind. She rarely spoke in court. When she did, it was with the practiced softness of someone who understands that a single well-placed whisper can do more than an hour of shouting. Her son stayed mostly in the background, but never so far that people could forget his face or his lineage. She did not hurry. Rome rewarded those who survived long enough to pick through the rubble of their enemies' self-destruction. When the scandal finally broke, the one that would end Messalina, it was so grotesque that even a city accustomed to excess could not easily digest it. A mock marriage to another man, Gaius Silius, performed while still legally married to the emperor, with public ceremony and witnesses like a parody of statecraft and religion. It was the kind of act that transformed gossip into political necessity. Claudius, humiliated, surrounded by advisors who could smell his wounded pride, was persuaded that she must die. Valeria Messalina was executed in 48 AD on Claudius's orders after this affair, an episode Roman historians later treated as one of the great scandals of the imperial household. Agrippina did not have to lift a finger. She watched as Messalina, once the most powerful woman in Rome, was cut down not by some dramatic public confrontation, but quietly, behind a hedgerow in the gardens she had once commanded. There was no grand last speech, no statue toppled, just a life extinguished with the same casual efficiency that Tiberius had used against Agrippina's mother. Power in Rome rarely announced itself with fanfare when it killed. It preferred the whisper, the sudden absence. In the silence after Messalina's fall, a vacuum opened that could not remain empty. An emperor without a wife was an emperor without a domestic anchor, without a partner to host, to mediate, to be the public face of imperial domesticity. Claudius, weary and aging, needed stability. The Senate wanted the optics of moral repair. The people wanted the illusion that the excesses of the past would be corrected. Agrippina stepped forward, not as a supplicant, but as a solution. She did not rush into Claudius's arms. She let others float the idea first, whispers that such a union would heal the dynasty, that her Augustan blood would reinforce his authority, that a marriage within the imperial family would be a return to the old ways of sacred lineage. The problem was law. Roman law did not allow an uncle to marry his niece. Incest, the jurist muttered. An affront to custom, the moralist declared. But law, Agrippina understood, was not a boundary. It was an obstacle. And obstacles could be moved by the same tools that moved everything else in Rome: fear, desire, and the manipulation of pride. She appeared before the Senate not as a seductress, but as a symbol, draped in conservative finery, eyes lowered just enough to suggest respect, but not submission. She let others speak of duty in dynastic necessity. Augustus himself had married within the family, they argued. The gods had made this bloodline exceptional. Could human law truly stand above destiny? The senators debated. Some were genuinely scandalized. Others were merely calculating how this alliance might shift balances they had grown comfortable with. Claudius, for his part, vacillated as he always did, pulled between impulse and counsel. Agrippina understood him. He was a man who wanted to be respected, but had never learned how to command it. He was tired of being the butt of jokes told behind carefully closed doors. To be desired by a woman of such pedigree, to be portrayed as the strong central trunk that could graft together wandering branches of the imperial family, this appealed to something deep in him. In 49 AD, the Senate formally sanctioned Claudius's marriage to Agrippina by changing the rules to permit an uncle-niece marriage on dynastic grounds, a legal bending that signaled how far Rome would go for the Julio-Claudian succession. The law bent. Exceptions were made. What had been unthinkable became merely controversial, then became reality. Agrippina married her uncle. On the day of the wedding, the streets glittered with procession. Statues of the gods watched with unmoving eyes as priests muttered blessings over a union that some whispered would make even the divine blush. Trumpets sounded. The people cheered because that was what they were supposed to do, and because if you shouted loudly enough, you could drown out the feeling that something fundamental had shifted beneath your feet. For Agrippina, it was not about love. It was never about love. As she entered the palace as Empress, she was not thinking of Claudius's hands or his lips or his hesitations. She was thinking of columns and corridors, of offices and guards, of ledgers and locks. She was thinking of the throne and the boy who might one day sit upon it. Her son walked beside her, no longer just the relic of a broken first marriage, but now the child of the emperor's wife, positioned close enough to power that people could not help but imagine what it would look like when that proximity turned into inheritance. Agrippina had clawed her way back from exile to the center of the storm. She had seen what happened when women in her family challenged power head-on and lost. She had learned. She would not challenge power, she would become it. Part 2. The Return and the Architect. The palace received her not as a guest, but as a returning fact of nature. Walls that had watched Augustus and Tiberius and Caligula now watched Agrippina cross their halls with a step that was neither hurried nor hesitant. Servants bowed more deeply than they had when she was merely the emperor's niece. Courtiers turned to measure her gown, her posture, the glint of calculation in her eyes. She noted everything. The way Claudius's secretaries avoided his gaze when they brought him documents he did not fully understand. The shuffle in the stance of the Praetorian Guard when he spoke too softly to be heard clearly. The way petitions piled up untouched on tables while the emperor devoted himself to histories of Carthage and Etruria, to details of the past rather than decisions of the present. Rome, she realized, was ruled by a man who preferred the dead to the living. In that gap between the scroll and the sword, there was room for her. She did not seize it all at once. The palace was a nest of watchful eyes, many of them old enough to remember her as a girl, as the sister of the mad emperor who had almost destroyed them, as the daughter of a woman who had dared defy Tiberius and starved for it. They expected another Messalina, another blaze of appetite that would burn out quickly and leave only ash. Agrippina made sure to disappoint them. Her first display of power was not a feast or a lover, it was a dismissal. The household staff loyal to Messalina, the ones who had whispered in her ear, carried her notes, shielded her indiscretions, were quietly transferred, dismissed, or reassigned to distant properties. Not all at once. That would have looked like vengeance. One by one under pretexts that could not be easily challenged. Health, age, family duties, promotions that were effectively exiles dressed in brocade. In their place, she installed her own people. Women who had endured exile with her, freedmen whose loyalties were unambiguous because their futures depended on hers, stewards who came from families that had backed Germanicus and had never forgiven Tiberius for what he had done. A palace is not ruled from the throne. It is ruled from the kitchens, the accounts, the bedchamber doors. Within a year, the routes by which information moved inside those walls no longer led to Messalina's memory or Claudius's distracted ear. They led to Agrippina, yet she rarely raised her voice. At dinner, she sat slightly back, letting other women chatter, letting senators bask in their own anecdotes. When Claudius spoke hesitantly about some legal question, she listened intently, nodding, making him feel not mocked, but consulted. Later in private, she would frame what needed to be done as something he had almost already decided himself. "You were right, my lord, when you said the province needed firmer guidance," she would murmur, as if repeating a thought that had indeed crossed his mind. "If you appoint this man, it will show your strength and your memory of those who served your father." He would blink, trying to recall when exactly he had said such a thing. But it sounded like him in the way that a well-forged coin sounds like real silver when struck. And he wanted to be that sort of emperor. He would sign. Word spread quietly that access to the emperor now meant, in practice, access to his wife. Petitioners began to court her favor with gifts described as tokens of respect to the imperial household. She accepted some, refused others, and always made the act of acceptance seem like a concession won by the petitioner's eloquence rather than her hunger. All the while her son watched. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, soon to be renamed Nero, absorbed the choreography of power with the openness of youth and the sharpness of a mind that had not yet been dulled by indulgence. He saw how his mother could make a room fall silent with a glance, how she could commend a man so warmly that he never noticed the strings she had tied around his throat. At night, when she allowed herself a sliver of unguarded time, she would study him in turn. His features were a strange mix of ancestors, the jaw of his father's brutal line, the eyes of her own. There was softness there, an artistic sensitivity that could turn either to genuine feeling or to theatrical cruelty, depending on how the world shaped it. She intended to shape it before anyone else could. The first great tool she chose was a voice. Lucius Annaeus Seneca had once been a rising star in Rome, philosopher, rhetorician, a man whose prose rolled over listeners like a carefully controlled tide. Then Caligula had taken offense at his talent and nearly killed him for the crime of making other men listen too intently. Exile had saved him from a quick death, but condemned him to a slower one in obscurity. Around 41 to 49 AD, Seneca had lived on the island of Corsica, banished from court politics. Agrippina remembered his earlier brilliance in the Senate and recognized that in a court where men preferred flattery to thought, a mind like his could be dangerous or priceless, depending on who owned it. She arranged for his recall. Officially, the argument was that Nero needed a tutor worthy of his noble blood, someone who could instill in him not only knowledge, but virtue. The emperor, eager to be seen as responsible and enlightened, allowed it. After all, what danger could there be in giving a boy a philosopher as a teacher? Around 49 to 50 AD, Seneca returned to Rome and was appointed as Nero's tutor, a move that effectively made him both educator and future speechwriter for the heir apparent. When he first stood before Agrippina in the quiet of a private audience, she did not waste time with flattery. "You know why you are here," she said. He bowed slightly. "To educate your son." "To help build him," she corrected. "Not merely to stuff his head with the myths of others, but to help make him a myth in his own right." There was something in the way she said it, an echo of her father's rhetoric, the cold fire of a woman who had seen too much and would not apologize for wanting more. Seneca studied her and understood that he stood at a crossroads. He could refuse, but refusal in Rome was rarely simple. It might mean another exile, or worse. He could accept and become an ornament, saying noble words while others made real decisions, or he could accept and attempt something both grand and terrifying, to shape the mind of a future emperor, and perhaps, through him, the fate of the empire. "Your son has a quick mind," he murmured, recalling the boy he had glimpsed in passing. "But his nature is still unformed." "Then form it," Agrippina said. "Teach him how to speak so Rome will listen. Teach him how to appear just, even when he must be ruthless. Teach him how to be loved without allowing love to control him." Seneca hesitated. "And virtue?" Agrippina's gaze did not flicker. "If virtue helps him keep the throne, then by all means, give it to him." He did not smile. Neither did she. The contract between them was clear. He would clothe ambition in philosophy. He would not be her conscience. He would be her instrument. From that day, Nero's education became a carefully staged performance as much as a set of lessons. Seneca drilled him in rhetoric until his words flowed easily, taught him Greek until he could quote tragedians with only a hint of affectation. He introduced him to the idea of clemency, of measured anger, of the ways in which a ruler's mercy could be a more potent form of control than terror. But Agrippina always hovered at the edge of these sessions, unseen or half-seen, making sure that no lesson would lead her son to believe he did not need her. When Seneca spoke of self-mastery, she would later remind Nero of those who had mastered themselves right into obscurity. When Seneca praised moderation, she would quietly recount how Tiberius's cold restraint had still led to the slow murder of her mother. Virtue, in her telling, was a garment to be worn when it suited the weather, not an iron cage. The second great tool she chose was a sword. The Praetorian Guard had once been the personal bodyguard of the emperor, but over time it had become something else, a deciding vote wrapped in armor. They had raised Claudius to the throne after Caligula's death, dragging him from behind a curtain like a forgotten piece of furniture, suddenly recognized as valuable. They could, in theory, do the same to another man if they ever believed it to be in their interest. Agrippina knew that an emperor without control of the guard was an emperor at the mercy of their whims. She also knew that no amount of charm could permanently bind men whose loyalty was divided between two commanders. At that time, the guard had two prefects at its head, men appointed before her rise, with loyalties scattered like the pattern on a mosaic, a bit to Claudius, a bit to their own ambitions, a bit to the highest bidder. Agrippina preferred simplicity. One sword, one hand on the hilt. Through a combination of suggestion and manufactured scandal, the two existing prefects were edged into disfavor. Failures in discipline were exaggerated. Minor breaches of protocol became grave offenses when repeated by the right tongues in the right ears. Claudius, ever susceptible to anxiety over plots, was persuaded that his safety required a reorganization. Enter Sextus Afranius Burrus. Burrus was not a dandy of the court, not a man of honeyed phrases. He was a soldier, broad-shouldered, disciplined, his reputation for integrity so solid that even his enemies hesitated to slander him. He had served loyally, quietly for years without making an ostentatious bid for attention. Around 51 AD, Burrus was appointed as sole prefect of the Praetorian Guard, a deliberate consolidation of power that placed the capital's elite troops under a single, reliable commander linked to Agrippina's faction. When Agrippina recommended him, it was with the air of someone reluctantly acknowledging that, regrettable as it might be to offend others, the emperor's safety must come first. "Burrus is above suspicion," she said softly in Claudius's private chamber, as a scribe pretended not to listen. "He seeks no glory, only duty. If the guard is united under him, you will sleep more easily." Claudius, who rarely slept easily, seized on the idea like a drowning man on driftwood. The change was made. Burrus accepted the role with outward reluctance and inward clarity. He knew very well who had raised him up. In the months that followed, when decrees needed to be enforced, when the streets muttered of some minor uprising, it was Burrus who moved the guard at Agrippina's quiet nod. Officially, he acted on Claudius's commands. In reality, those commands were increasingly shaped by the woman who shared his bed, and more importantly, his fears. With Seneca guiding Nero's mind and Burrus commanding the steel that ringed the palace, Agrippina had done something no woman in Rome's history had yet achieved. She had wrapped intellect and force together in her service. Her next move was more delicate. Britannicus, the natural son of Claudius and the executed Messalina, still lived within the palace walls. A boy of good character, if somewhat sheltered, he was beloved by those who preferred clearer lines of succession, and by those who had served his mother and felt guilty for how quickly they had abandoned her. He was, in simple terms, a problem. Agrippina did not hate him. Hate is a luxury in politics. She regarded him the way a general regards a hill held by the enemy, not with passion, but with practical coldness. While he lived and while the law recognized him as Claudius's heir, her plans would always rest on unstable ground. She did not move directly against him. That would have been too obvious, too crass. Instead, she set about shrinking his shadow. Publicly, she promoted an image of family unity. Nero, now formally adopted as Claudius's son and granted a new name, Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, was presented at ceremonies side by side with Britannicus. But the choreography was carefully arranged. Nero's formal adoption took place in 50 AD, giving him the emperor's name and status. Although Britannicus was Claudius's natural son, the adoption made Nero legally senior, and in practice the preferred successor. Nero was slightly older and always placed half a step in front. When crowds cheered, the heralds called Nero's name first. When the emperor praised his sons, he did so with phrases drafted by Seneca that emphasized Nero's oratorical promise, his cultured demeanor, his resemblance to the noble line of Germanicus. Britannicus, by contrast, found his tutors replaced, his circle of companions thinned of those most loyal to him. He was gently, almost imperceptibly, kept away from the barracks where the praetorians laughed and drank with Nero. Burrus saw to it that the soldiers' affections were subtly redirected. A joke here, a favor there, a commendation for a guard who had done well escorting Nero to a ceremony. In the Senate, statues and inscriptions began to appear in which Nero's name was paired with phrases like hope of the Roman people, future of the empire, light of the Julio-Claudian line. These things did not happen on their own. They were planted, watered, and harvested by Agrippina's agents, who understood that repetition creates inevitability. When Claudius finally announced Nero's formal elevation above Britannicus in the succession, it seemed less like a radical decision and more like the recognition of a fact the city had already accepted. The ceremony was all polished marble and incense. Claudius, adorned with the gleam of office that never quite sat naturally on his shoulders, proclaimed Nero his son and heir. Nero knelt, eyes shining with a mixture of genuine emotion and well-rehearsed gratitude. The crowd, assembled carefully to include those whose cheers could be relied on, roared. Britannicus stood to one side, trying to maintain the composure taught to him by men who still believed in the old stories of duty and honor. He watched as the invisible ladder he had spent his life assuming he would one day climb was pulled away and leaned against another boy's window. Agrippina's gaze flickered towards him only once, not long enough to invite suspicion, but long enough to mark the moment in her own mental ledger. The trap had indeed snapped shut. From that day, every step Nero took through the palace corridors sounded different. Servants bowed lower. Senators addressed him with a careful mix of respect and calculation. He was no longer merely the Empress's son. He was the man most expected to follow Claudius when age or illness, or something less natural, finally claimed him. At night when she sat alone, Agrippina sometimes thought back to the astrologer and the dim room filled with the smell of oil and destiny. The path between that prophecy and this ceremony had not been straight. It had wound through exile and scandal, through marriages and calculated silences. But it had brought her here, to a moment where the future emperor of Rome was her creation. She allowed herself a rare, small smile, not of joy exactly, but of vindication. The world that had crushed her mother and unmade her brother had not managed to break her. She had bent it, power by power, law by law, man by man. Of course, the game was not finished. Claudius still sat on the throne, and though he was often weak and easily moved, he was not dead. Britannicus, though sidelined, still breathed. Destiny might have sketched its outline, but the details still required ink. She knew that in Rome, nothing was secure until the last rival was buried and the last obstacle dissolved. The day would come when someone would have to die. Part 3. The Mushroom and the Crown. The palace had its own seasons, distinct from the turning of the year outside. Winters of suspicion, springs of favor, summers of indulgence, autumns of quiet reshuffling, when those who had stood too close to the sun found themselves conveniently reassigned to distant provinces or estates. For a time after Nero's adoption, the season was one of uneasy balance. Agrippina's position had never been higher. Her face appeared on coins beside Claudius's, an honor that sent murmurs through the city, and she was accorded the title Augusta, a rare distinction for a living imperial woman. Statues depicted her in the pose of a goddess, draped in virtue and authority. She received foreign envoys from a raised seat, her son sometimes on one side and the emperor on the other, as if she were the hinge between present and future. Yet beneath the marble surface, hairline fractures began to appear. Now, Claudius, who had always been a man more comfortable with books than with knives, started to feel the chill of his own vulnerability. He had seen one wife devour her own reputation and die for it. Now he watched another wife accumulate power with a carefulness that was, in its own way, more terrifying. He was not blind. He saw the way ministers now approached Agrippina first. He heard the way people referred to the plans of the imperial couple, when those plans had, in truth, been born entirely in her mind. He knew that the guard under Burrus answered to him, but unconsciously tilted toward her. At night, when the lamps were low and his joints ached and the specter of mortality hovered close, doubt whispered to him. Had he made a mistake? When he looked at Britannicus, now a young man with his own quiet dignity, the doubt grew louder. Here was the boy who was his in blood and in law, until he himself had agreed to rewrite that law. Here was the son who shared his name without an asterisk, who had once been the unquestioned heir until the machinery of persuasion and fear and flattery had moved otherwise. Sometimes Claudius would drink too much, loosened by wine and the rare sensation of speaking without waiting for someone to correct him. In those moments, he would gesture vaguely toward Britannicus and mutter about restoring what is proper and correcting injustices. Servants heard, servants talked. Agrippina learned. The first time she heard that Claudius had, in a half-drunken haze, lamented the adoption and hinted at a change of heart, she dismissed it as the emotional noise of an old man frightened by his own frailty. Wine made men philosophical, and philosophy made them unreliable. But when the stories repeated, when the same themes surfaced again and again in different mouths, that he had said the gods frowned on uncle-niece marriage, that he regretted bending the law, that Britannicus was more truly his, this stopped being background noise. It became a pattern. She watched him more closely. His gestures with Britannicus grew warmer, a hand on the boy's shoulder that lingered half a heartbeat too long, a question directed to him at dinner, inviting his opinion on some minor matter of governance, a smile that held something like paternal pride rather than mere habit. None of this would have mattered if Claudius had been a man of steel, but Claudius was a man of clay, molded by whatever hands pressed most firmly. If his heart tilted back toward Britannicus, there was nothing in his nature to prevent him from one day calling the jurists and the priests and undoing what had been done. Law had bent once. It could bend again. Agrippina did not indulge in panic. Panic is noisy. Panic makes mistakes. She let the fear rise just long enough to sharpen her thinking, then cooled it into determination. The truth she had always known was now impossible to ignore. The future she had crafted could not fully exist while Claudius still sat on the throne. It was a truth with a simple, brutal corollary. Claudius would have to die before he could change his mind. She did not reach this conclusion lightly. For all his weakness, he had given her a path back to the center of power. He had, in his fumbling way, loved her, or at least needed her enough to mistake that need for love. There were nights when he had lain beside her, mumbling half-formed worries about the state, about grain supplies and border skirmishes, and she had soothed him not entirely out of calculation, but with a trace of something adjacent to pity. But pity, in her world, was a luxury she could offer only to the dead. Claudius was still alive, and as long as he remained so, he was a lever that others could pull against her. The decision, once made, demanded action. Poison was Rome's most intimate weapon. Legions could crush enemies abroad, but at home, in the quiet corridors where succession was decided, it was often a cup, a dish, a feather that changed history. Blood on the floor could inspire revolt. A sudden illness, by contrast, could be accepted as the will of the gods or the folly of nature. By the mid-50s AD, later Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius would describe Claudius's death as a poisoning, and they would lay the responsibility at Agrippina's feet, naming favorite dishes, especially mushrooms, as the vehicle. Agrippina had heard, as everyone in Rome had heard, of a woman whose name was spoken in whispers in the darker corners of the city, Locusta. Locusta was not a courtier. She was not wrapped in fine fabrics or perfumed with spikenard. She was a technician of death, a specialist in toxins, a woman who had learned, through gruesome trial and error, how different substances crawled through the body, how they could be masked, delayed, hastened. Her workshop was not a place of marble and gold. It was a den of jars and plants, dried roots and viscous liquids, caged animals used to test new mixtures. She had become a rumor with a face. Summoning her was itself a statement. Agrippina did it discreetly. When Locusta was brought into a side chamber of the palace under cover of night, she bowed awkwardly, unused to such surroundings. Her hands were stained, not with ink like a scribe's, but with the residues of her trade. "You know who I am," Agrippina said. Locusta nodded. "Everyone does, my lady." "And I know who you are," Agrippina replied. "You are said to be the best at what you do." Locusta's eyes flicked up, wary. "I make things that unmake people. That is all." Agrippina did not flinch. "I need something precise. It must be administered at table. It must seem at first like nothing more than a faintness, a bad turn. Later, if necessary, it can turn violent." "Who is the target?" Locusta asked, though she likely already knew. "Your emperor," Agrippina said calmly. There it was, spoken aloud. The line crossed. Locusta swallowed. To kill a man was one thing. To kill the emperor was another. But she was already enmeshed in the machinery of those who sought such services. Refusing now would paint a mark on her back. Accepting would at least grant her the protection of success, for a while. "He is old," Locusta said slowly. "People will say it was his time." "Exactly." Agrippina stepped closer. "You will prepare something that can be folded into his favorite dish. The mushrooms he loves so much. It must act swiftly but not so explosively that no one believes it natural." Locusta considered. "There are preparations from the Amanita and other finds from the forests. Combined in the right way, disguised with sauces, he will feel only a tightness, a struggle to breathe. Later the body will convulse. They will blame his age, his indulgence, perhaps some old ailment of the stomach." "If it fails?" Agrippina asked. "Then we have a problem," Locusta said bluntly. "A half measure is worse than none." Agrippina nodded. "Then we will not allow it to fail." A plan formed like frost along the edges of a window. The day selected was one of celebration, when the palace would be full of noise, and the emperor's gluttony could be framed as part of the festivities. The dish was set, a plate of mushrooms, rich and fragrant, prepared by cooks who did not know that an extra ingredient had been added in another room before being sent to the table. Agrippina moved through the preparations with the poise of a woman organizing a banquet, not an assassination. She directed seating, ordered musicians, arranged which senators would present which petitions after the meal. She touched Claudius's arm, smiled at him, laughed at his clumsy jokes, poured wine into his cup. Inside, her thoughts were as cold and ordered as if she were supervising a sacrifice. When the dish arrived, steamy and inviting, Claudius's eyes lit up. He had always had a particular fondness for mushrooms, calling them the food of the gods. It was a small flaw in a man with many larger ones, but flaws do not need to be large to be fatal. He lifted the first portion to his mouth with greedy anticipation. Agrippina watched his throat move as he swallowed. She did not stare. That would have been too obvious. She let her gaze drift around the table, sometimes meeting Nero's eyes, sometimes nodding at a senator's remark. But a part of her was entirely focused on the emperor's breathing, on the color of his cheeks. At first, nothing, then a flicker. Claudius shifted in his seat, a hand going to his stomach. He grimaced slightly, blinking as if the room had blurred. "Too much wine, my lord?" one of the guests joked nervously. Claudius muttered something unintelligible. He reached for his cup, but his fingers trembled. Sweat broke out on his brow. His breath came faster, then hitched. Agrippina's heart tapped once against her ribs, not with compassion, but with the knowledge that this was the moment between worlds. If he recovered, if someone cried for a physician quickly enough, if an antidote happened to be at hand, then everything she had built might crumble under suspicion. The emperor gagged, retched. A hush fell over the table, broken only by the scrape of chairs as people stood. Servants rushed forward, some out of genuine concern, others out of fear for what would happen to them if the emperor died unattended. "Call the doctor!" someone shouted. The physician arrived flustered, his mind racing through a list of ailments. Food poisoning? A stroke? Some old affliction flaring up? He ordered Claudius to be moved to a couch in an adjoining room, away from the eyes of panicking guests. Agrippina moved with them, her face arranged in an expression of alarm. Inside, she burned with cold fury. Claudius was not dying quickly enough. His body fought, clinging stubbornly to life as if by sheer habit. Locusta, anticipating this possibility, had prepared a second stage. A feather, she had said, dipped in a concentrated form of the same toxins. If the first dose did not fully do its work, the pretense of inducing vomiting could be used to introduce the rest. The physician, either complicit or easily guided, took the feather now. "We must relieve his stomach," he said, as if reciting from a script. He slid the feather down Claudius's throat to provoke further expulsion. It did more than that. Within moments, Claudius's convulsions intensified. His eyes rolled back. Foam tinged with pink appeared at the corners of his mouth. His breath became ragged, then shallow, then ceased. The doctor placed his fingers on the emperor's neck, feeling for a pulse he already knew would not be there. After a suitably dramatic pause, he looked up at Agrippina. "My lady," he said softly, "the gods have called him." Claudius died in October 54 AD. While the official explanation was natural illness, multiple ancient accounts, especially Tacitus and Suetonius, insist he was poisoned, with Agrippina orchestrating the act to secure Nero's succession. Agrippina let the words wash over her like cold water. She bowed her head, allowing tears to well up, not entirely feigned, because endings are always, in some way, a small death even for those who engineer them. She covered her face briefly, then composed herself. "The news must be prepared," she said. "The people must be told at the proper time. We must not alarm them." That was not piety. That was calculation. If the death were announced immediately, at the chaotic end of a banquet, rumors would breed like flies. Whispers of poison, of treachery, would spread before any succession could be neatly settled. But if the announcement came at an hour chosen with care, when she had already arranged the right people in the right places, then the transition could be wrapped in ritual and inevitability. She ordered that Claudius's body be attended to, that priests be summoned quietly, that the palace gates be watched but not yet closed. She sent messengers to Burrus and Seneca, to Nero. In the interim, the old emperor lay still, his face pallid and slack, gray hair damp against his temples. To some he had been a joke, to others a surprisingly fair administrator. To Agrippina, in that final gaze, he was simply an obstacle removed. Time in a crisis is elastic. An hour can feel like a year. Agrippina used those hours like a sculptor uses clay. She met with Burrus in a small windowless chamber. "The emperor is dead," she said plainly. Burrus's jaw tightened, but he did not waste breath on shock he had half expected. "The guard stands ready," he said, "but they will ask who commands them now." "Nero does," Agrippina replied. "You will announce it at my signal. The Senate will hesitate. Some may speak of Britannicus. You will remind them that the guard chose an emperor once before in a moment of confusion. This time, there will be no confusion. Burrus nodded slowly. His loyalty to her had been cemented over years, but it was not blind. He knew the dangers of placing a boy on the throne, yet he also saw the alternative, a contested succession, perhaps civil strife. In that equation, backing Nero under Agrippina's guidance seemed the more stable path. Seneca was summoned next. He arrived with ink still on his fingers, as if he had been seized from his desk. His face was pale, not from surprise at Claudius's death. Again, he had surely contemplated that outcome, but from the knowledge that the moment he had been preparing Nero for was now a reality. He is ready, Seneca said, more to himself than to Agrippina, as ready as anyone could be. No one is ready to be emperor, Agrippina said quietly, but he will learn, and you will help him. She looked at him, weighing. You will also help shape how this death is remembered. The people must think of Claudius as a good ruler who passed naturally. We gain nothing from painting him as weak now. Seneca, ever the rhetorician, understood the assignment. He would craft eulogies that praise Claudius's diligence, his building projects, his attention to law. He would smooth over the roughness of the end with finely turned phrases. When the auspicious hour calculated by the court astrologers finally arrived, a time chosen for its favorable omens, Agrippina stepped out onto a balcony overlooking a courtyard crowded with officials, soldiers, and carefully selected citizens. Her black veil fluttered in the breeze. Her posture was straight, imperial. Romans, she began, her voice carrying with the help of skilled acoustics and tense silence. The man who has guided our state, your emperor, my husband, has departed this life. The gods have reclaimed him. There was a murmur, a collective intake of breath. She continued, weaving grief with reassurance. Claudius had labored for Rome, she said. He had borne the burdens of rule with great effort, despite his frailties. Now, in accordance with his will and the will of the gods, the torch would be passed to one who shared both his blood and the sacred blood of Augustus. He whose virtues you already know, she said, gesturing toward the doors behind her. Nero, Claudius, Caesar, Drusus, Germanicus. At that cue, the doors opened. Nero stepped out, dressed not in the full regalia of victory, but in the more somber attire suited to a state in mourning. His expression had been carefully prepared in the mirror, sorrowful yet resolute, humbled yet not cowed. Nero was about 16 years old at his accession in 54 AD, the youngest man yet to assume sole rule over the Roman Empire, and his early government was nominally a partnership between himself, Agrippina, Seneca, and Burrus. The Praetorian Guard, already briefed and in formation, struck their spears against the ground in unison. The sound rolled across the courtyard like thunder. "Hail, Emperor!" Burrus called out, his voice setting the tone for the chorus to follow. "Hail, Emperor!" the soldiers roared, their cry taken up by others in the crowd. In that roar, Britannicus's hopeful future dissolved like smoke. He was somewhere inside the palace at that moment, perhaps staring at a closed door, perhaps held back by handlers who spoke soothing words about propriety and order. If he tried to push past them, his protest would have been muffled by the noise outside. By the time the acclamations faded, it would be done. Rome had heard a name, had cheered, and in so doing had accepted a reality that would be difficult to unwind without tearing something deep in the fabric of the state. Agrippina stood slightly behind and to the side of Nero as he raised his hand in acknowledgement. In the eyes of the world, she was the grieving widow presenting the new ruler. In her own mind, she was the architect revealing the completed facade of a building whose foundations she had laid stone by stone. As Nero began his first formal address, words shaped by Seneca, emotions coached by his mother and his advisors, Agrippina watched the faces below. Some shone with genuine hope. Others were masks of politic enthusiasm. A few, very few, showed a flicker of apprehension, the calculation of men who wondered which way this new wind would blow. She memorized them. The city, the empire, the whole trembling edifice of Roman power had been given a new focal point in a single hour. But she knew better than anyone that this was not an ending. It was an opening. She had placed her son on the throne. Now she had to keep him there, and keep him pointed in a direction that did not destroy her before fate's deadline arrived. In the days that followed, Rome arranged itself around its new emperor the way water rearranges around a new stone cast into a river. Decrees were issued in Nero's name, though the language came from Seneca's stylus and the priorities from Agrippina's conversations. Coins were struck bearing his profile, youthful and idealized, with inscriptions praising his piety, his clemency, his promise. Public games were held, not too lavish. Respect for the mourning period demanded a certain restraint, but generous enough to remind the people that a new age might mean new prosperity. Grain distributions were made slightly more frequent. Punishments for some minor offenses were commuted, an early gesture toward the image of a merciful ruler. Agrippina's presence in these early days was unmistakable. She appeared at Nero's side in council chambers, said to be advising him in matters of domestic management and family. She received petitions on his behalf when he was ostensibly too occupied with affairs of state. When foreign ambassadors arrived, they were welcomed into a hall where Nero sat on a raised chair, and just beside him, on a throne only slightly lower, sat his mother. That image would be preserved in carvings and in the uneasy memories of men who were not accustomed to bowing before a woman as if she too held the reins of empire. Some nights, when the air in the palace was thick with incense and the murmur of distant music, Nero would find himself alone with her in a smaller room lit by a few carefully placed lamps. "You did well today," she would say, pouring wine into his cup, watching how much he drank. "Seneca wrote most of the words," Nero would reply with a self-deprecating smile. "Words must be spoken to live," Agrippina would counter. "He gives you cloth. You make it into a garment. Do not underestimate the power of your own voice." He would study her then, a faint crease between his brows. "Would I be emperor without you?" he asked once. She held his gaze. "No," she said simply. "You would not." There was no warmth in the admission, but there was a kind of hardness that he mistook, perhaps, for love. Being indispensable is one way of binding someone. Another is letting them believe they have outgrown you. Agrippina preferred the former. For now, somewhere within her, the words of the astrologer still echoed. He will be emperor. He will kill his mother. Now, she had brought him to the first half of that sentence. The second half, she told herself, belonged to a future distant enough to be discounted. A prophecy was a shape, not a schedule. She had time. Time to rule through him. Time to show Rome that a woman could, if not officially sit on the throne, effectively command it. Time, she hoped, to figure out how to escape fate's last line. Part 4. The Poison Cup and the Cracks. In the first bright months of Nero's reign, Rome dared to hope. The new emperor was young, handsome, talented in ways that charmed a city grown weary of old men and their cautious decrees. He loved music, poetry, performances. He could speak with fluency in the Senate, his voice trained by Seneca to rise and fall with practiced sincerity. He made gestures of clemency, recalling some exiles, reducing harsh sentences that soothed a population accustomed to the sharp edges of autocracy. Nero had come to power in 54 AD at around 16 years old, formally guided by a kind of cabinet made up of Agrippina, Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. Ancient commentators often describe these first years as comparatively moderate and competent, especially compared to what would follow. Agrippina, watching from just behind the curtain of public life, allowed herself to feel something close to satisfaction. The facade she had helped construct was holding. The people cheered Nero and whispered that perhaps, at last, an emperor had arrived, who combined noble blood with youthful energy and cultivated taste. In those days, he called her the best of mothers. It was more than a private endearment. Ancient biographers note that Nero even used the best of mothers as an early watchword for his guards, a symbolic nod to Agrippina's central role in his rise. For a brief, dazzling moment, mother and son appeared united at the summit of the Roman world. Yet the same phrase had another, quieter effect. It reminded other men, Seneca, Burrus, old senators hardened by decades of intrigue, that the emperor was still, in some essential ways, a son first and a ruler second. That was not a comfortable thought for them. For all they owed to Agrippina, For all the ways they had benefited from her patronage, they could not forget that Rome was a city that officially worshipped the masculine virtues: courage, firmness, self-control. These were supposed to be the qualities of the man at the center. To see that man overshadowed by a woman, even one of imperial blood, offended deep, unspoken assumptions. The first clash came not with laws or armies, but with chairs. An embassy from Armenia, that restless kingdom between Rome and Parthia, was to be received in the palace. It was an important audience, symbolic not only of Rome's reach, but of the new emperor's place in the complex web of foreign loyalties. In the hall prepared for the reception, workmen arranged a raised platform. On it stood a central throne for Nero. Beside it, at the same height and only slightly less ornate, they placed a second seat for Agrippina. Agrippina's prominence was visible in public iconography at this time. She had appeared on coins with Claudius, and now she sometimes received envoys alongside Nero, a near unprecedented visibility for a Roman woman. When Seneca entered and saw the arrangement, a flicker of alarm crossed his otherwise controlled features. Burrus, arriving shortly afterward, frowned outright. "A double throne," Seneca murmured. "That will not go unnoticed." "She wishes to show the continuity of the dynasty," a steward said, trying to defend a decision that had clearly not been his. Burrus's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. "She wishes to be seen ruling beside him," he said bluntly. They both understood the risk. If foreign envoys went home saying that Rome was now governed by a mother and son together, the image of Nero as sole, decisive ruler would be permanently blurred. More immediately, the Senate would hear of it and murmur that the emperor had abdicated some essential portion of his masculine authority to a woman. When Agrippina entered the hall, robed in garments heavy with embroidery and pearls, she saw the arrangement and approved with a single, satisfied glance. It was a visual representation of what she believed to be true, that power flowed through both chairs, even if the law recognized only one of them. She was about to take her seat when Seneca and Burrus stepped forward. "My lady," Seneca said carefully, "some in the Senate are not yet accustomed to the sight of a woman so near the insignia of rule, and foreign kings may misinterpret our customs. It might be wise for now to receive the envoys with you in a slightly different position." "Different?" she asked, her eyes narrowing just fractionally. Burrus gestured to a spot slightly behind and to the side of the throne. "Here, where all can see that you are honored and consulted, but where there is no confusion about the emperor's singular station." The argument was draped in deference, but Agrippina heard the core of it plainly. "Stand back." She held their gaze for a long moment. To refuse would be to provoke a public confrontation in front of the foreign delegation. To agree would be to accept, in stone and symbol, a lesser place. At last she inclined her head, as if graciously yielding to the needs of protocol rather than being forced to retreat. "Very well," she said, each syllable precise. "Let it be as you advise. For now." She did not raise her voice. She did not lash out. But a chill settled over the hall that even the bright banners could not dispel. Nero, when he entered later and took his place, did not quite understand the undercurrent. He saw only that his mother stood slightly behind him, not beside, and that the men he trusted had relieved him of an awkward visual dilemma. He smiled at her uncertainly. She smiled back, the curve of her lips smooth, the temperature behind it unreadable. That day lodged like a splinter in her memory. It was not a single act that changed everything, but it was a sign. The boy who had once clung to her counsel above all was now surrounded by other voices that dared, gently, carefully, to suggest that her presence might sometimes be a hindrance. At first she tried to ignore it. The machine of state, still in practice, ran through her corridors. Her name still opened doors. Petitioners still came to her with the knowledge that securing Agrippina's support greatly increased their chances with Nero. She still sat in on many councils, her opinions solicited and often followed. But the tiny adjustments multiplied. Nero began to meet with Seneca and Burrus alone more frequently. When decrees were drafted, they bore fewer of her unmistakable fingerprints and more of the careful balance those men preferred, trying to shape a ruler who would be admired for moderation rather than feared for sudden storms of favor and disfavor. In small matters, Nero started to assert himself in ways that felt, to him, like steps toward manhood. He changed the timing of a procession his mother had planned. He appointed a minor official on his own recommendation rather than hers. He pushed back when she criticized one of his musical performances before a select audience. "Rome needs a strong emperor, not a timid boy singing in private," she had said. "Rome will have a strong emperor," he retorted, his jaw tight. "But Rome will also hear my voice." It was a small argument, quickly smoothed over, but it left a residue. Agrippina realized that the sun she had shaped was beginning to test the boundaries of the mold. Britannicus hovered at the edges of this shifting landscape, like a ghost that had not yet decided whether to haunt or to fade. He had grown into a young man of unassuming dignity, less flamboyant than Nero, less inclined to speeches and spectacles, but with a quiet, steady presence that some older senators found more reassuring. He resembled Claudius in ways that were both physical and temperamental, and those who had served the old emperor could not help but feel a tug of loyalty when they saw him. Agrippina had worked for years to dim his prospects, to ensure that the city thought of Nero first when imagining the future. But a dethroned heir, if left alive and even modestly visible, is always a rallying point waiting for circumstances. As Nero's independent streak grew, so did Agrippina's anxiety about that possibility. Their quarrels, never loud, but increasingly pointed, sometimes ended with unguarded words. Once, in a moment of frustration, when he resisted one of her suggestions for a new appointment, she let the mask slip. "Remember who put you where you are," she said sharply. "Do not forget that I can find another." He stared at her. "Another?" he asked, his tone very still. "Britannicus is still Claudius's son," she replied. "If you will not be guided, there are those who would gladly accept the hand that shapes them." She meant it as a threat of leverage, a reminder that she still possessed alternative options. But it landed in Nero's mind as something deeper and more corrosive, proof that his mother's love was conditional, that he was, in some essential way, replaceable to her. That night he lay awake long after the lamps had been extinguished, listening to the distant clatter of guards changing shifts, the faint echo of laughter from some corner of the palace where servants drank in violation of curfew. He thought of Britannicus, of the boy who had once been his companion in lessons, then his rival in ceremony, then his subordinate in rank. He thought of the way some older men still glanced at Britannicus when talk of the future turned anxious. He thought of his mother's words, "I can find another." The logic of power was stark. So long as Britannicus lived, there was a potential alternative emperor for ambitious men, and for a mother who might one day decide her first creation no longer served her. Poison is not only a substance, it is a thought, a suspicion, an idea that once introduced spreads through the veins of trust. In Nero's mind, the idea took root. The moment came, as such moments often did in Rome, at a banquet. It was a carefully curated affair, not one of the wild orgies that later caricatures would attribute to Nero's reign, but a formal dinner with select guests, senators of influence, visiting dignitaries, key officers of the guard, the kind of occasion on which gestures carried the weight of omens. Agrippina was there, seated in a place of honor, but not as central as she would have preferred. She wore jewels that caught the lamplight and made her seem, for all the tension coiling inside her, like a figure carved from fire and stone. Britannicus sat further down the table, among the younger men. Nero, at the head, played the role of genial host well. He laughed at appropriate moments, told anecdote and jest, quoted a line or two of poetry in Greek to demonstrate his education. The wine flowed, the courses came and went, each more elaborate than the last. Musicians played softly in the background. Servants moved with trained softness between couches. Somewhere in the invisible machinery behind this display, another preparation had been made. Nero had, through intermediaries, sought out Locusta again, the same artisan of death who had provided the means for Claudius's exit. Later tradition is unanimous that she was used more than once by imperial hands and that Britannicus's end, like Claudius's, came by poison. This time the instructions were harsher and simpler. Claudius's death had at least been cloaked in the rationale of transfer of power. Now the removal of Britannicus was a cold act of consolidation by a reigning emperor. At the banquet, a servant moved with a decanter, refilling cups as he went. When he reached Britannicus, His hand paused for a fraction of a second, a tiny hitch that no one at the table noticed because they were all looking elsewhere, laughing at some minor joke Nero had delivered with rehearsed ease. Britannicus lifted his cup, unaware that its contents differed from those of his neighbors, and drank. Agrippina, mid-conversation with a senator about some estate dispute, glanced casually down the table. She saw her stepson sip, set the cup down, reach for a piece of bread. For a few heartbeats, nothing happened. Then his hand trembled. He swallowed again, reflexively, as if trying to dislodge something. His face tightened. He frowned, puzzled, and then his eyes widened in sudden, searing awareness that something was terribly wrong. His body jerked. The bread fell from his fingers. He made a strangled sound, half cough, half cry. Conversation stuttered and broke. Heads turned. A hush rolled down the table like a wave overtaking sand. "Britannicus?" someone called. He slid from his couch, crumpling onto the floor, limbs spasming. Foam bubbled at his lips. His eyes rolled, trying desperately to focus on something, anything, and finding only a blur of faces looming above him. Agrippina rose, every muscle in her body gone taut. There was a moment, not long enough for her to act, but long enough for an entire landscape of feeling to flash through her. Shock, calculation, recognition. This was not my hand. Something in her thought, "This is my son's." The room began to move again in bursts of panicked energy. Some guests stood frozen, cross-sectioned between the urge to help and the fear of being associated with a dying prince. Others shouted conflicting instructions. A servant hovered, torn between duty and terror. Nero half rose from his couch, face a mask of carefully arranged concern. "He has suffered these fits before," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It is a kind of falling sickness. Do not be alarmed." The official line would be that Britannicus had died of an epileptic seizure, but sources such as Tacitus insist that Nero had him poisoned in 55 AD to eliminate any lingering rival for the throne. The lie at the table was plausible enough to serve in the stunned moment. People want explanations when faced with the incomprehensible, and they will accept almost any that lets them avoid confronting the possibility of deliberate murder in their midst. The physician, summoned hastily, knelt beside Britannicus and went through the motions of checking breath and pulse. But whatever tincture Locusta had provided was efficient. Within minutes, the young man's body stilled. His chest did not rise again. "He is gone," the doctor whispered. Some at the table made the sign against evil. Others stared at Nero, trying to read in his face whether this was a tragedy he had expected or an inconvenience that would be reshaped into a story of unfortunate timing. Agrippina's gaze did not leave her son. In his eyes, she saw no grief. There was, perhaps, a flicker of genuine unease. Death, so close and so sudden, unsettles even those who order it. But there was also a hardness, a watchfulness, as if he were not mourning a brother but studying the room's reaction to a political event. Their eyes met. In that look, a lifetime of unspoken truths crashed together. She saw in him the echo of her own ruthlessness, taken one step further and turned inward against the very structures she had relied on. He saw in her a witness who understood exactly what he had done because she had shown him the contours of that kind of decision. For a heartbeat, Agrippina wanted to speak, to say, "Stop. This path ends in darkness deeper than you can imagine. I know. I have lived in its edges." To confess that in making him an emperor, she had given him tools that could cut anyone, including herself. But the hall was full of eyes and ears. A mother's plea would be a political act here, and a futile one at that. She lowered herself back onto her couch slowly, like a woman overborne by sorrow. The banquet did not continue. Even Nero, with all his budding taste for theatricality, understood that asking people to resume dining and joking over the fresh corpse of his half-brother would be a step too far, too soon. The guests were dismissed with solemn words about unexpected tragedy. Servants hurried to cover Britannicus's body and carry it away. Britannicus's death in 55 AD effectively removed the last direct dynastic rival in Claudius's line, leaving Nero unchallenged in blood and law, and later historians mark it as a key step in his slide toward more open cruelty. Agrippina, alone later in her chamber, sat without moving for a long time. She had not wept for Claudius. She did not weep for Britannicus. Tears were not her language for loss. Instead, she walked back through the path that had led to this moment and recognized with a clarity as sharp as any knife that she herself had set many of the stepping stones. By removing Britannicus from the line of succession, she had ensured that any later attempt to use him as a counter-emperor would be seen by Nero as an existential threat. By wielding him in an argument as a possible replacement, she had given Nero a motive sharpened by fear and wounded pride. She had spent years teaching Nero that survival at the top required the elimination of rivals. When he applied that lesson to a brother, he was not betraying her education. He was fulfilling it. Looking into the darkness of her chamber, she saw for the first time the full danger of what she had created. An emperor does not stop with one murder. From that night forward, something fundamental shifted between mother and son. The public displays of affection grew more formal, more constrained. Nero still called her mother in speeches, still allowed coins to be minted bearing her image for a time, still listened to her on matters that did not touch too directly on his personal desires. But in private, a distance opened. He visited her less often. When he did, their conversations were laced with subtext. "You did not mourn Britannicus," he observed once, his tone almost casual. "I learned long ago," she answered, "that Rome never stops long enough for anyone's grief. We endure, that is all." He tilted his head. "Endure what you have caused?" he asked. She met his gaze unflinchingly. "We all cause what we endure," she said. "You will learn that, if you have not already." It was an admission and an accusation wrapped together. Nero, who by then had begun to surround himself with new companions, young men and women who flattered his artistic ambitions and did not question his impulses, found his mother's unblinking gaze increasingly intolerable. She saw too much. She remembered too much. She could, if she chose, tell others the truths hidden beneath his official narratives. And she had power of her own. Contacts in the Senate, loyalists in the palace, a reputation among the people as the woman who had steered the state through the transition. As long as she remained close, he could never feel entirely secure that the crown sat on his head by right rather than by her continuing consent. Fear, once born, grows quickly in such soil. Agrippina sensed it before he articulated it. The invitations to dine together became fewer. Her presence at council meetings was regrettably omitted more often. When she raised her voice in opposition to some new favorite being granted a lucrative post, Nero's response was not to argue policy, but to bristle at the implicit challenge. "Must every decision be approved by you?" he snapped once. "I am emperor, not your steward." "And who made you emperor?" she shot back, anger cracking through her usual composure. He turned his back on her instead of answering. Later in his own chamber, among friends who laughed at his jokes and praised his poetry, he spoke more freely. "She thinks she can still unmake me," he said. "She speaks of Britannicus as if that was still an option. Does she imagine I will live forever in her shadow, forever the boy she used to command?" One of his companions, clever, ambitious, sensing opportunity, leaned closer. "A man is not truly emperor," he said softly, "while another holds his leash. Rome will not respect you as it should until you show that there is no one above you. Not in the guard, not in the Senate, not in your own family." The thought was not new to Nero. It had been circling in his mind since the day Seneca and Burrus had moved Agrippina away from the second throne. But hearing it spoken, under the veil of flattery and camaraderie, gave it new weight. He remembered the prophecy only in fragments, if at all, but the logic of fear needed no supernatural sanction. His mother had helped him to the throne. She could, in theory, help another. As long as she lived, he would never feel entirely safe. Agrippina, sitting alone more often now, listening to the palace's shifting sounds, understood that something had moved past the point of simple disagreement. She had spent her life reading men, charting the turning of their loyalties and the contours of their courage. Her son's courage was of a particular kind. He was brave enough to order others to act, but not brave enough to face absence of control. That kind of man, given absolute power, was more dangerous than any straightforward tyrant. He would see enemies in every independent will, even in the one that had once existed only to serve him. She thought again of the Chaldean and the dimly lit room, of the words that had seemed like a bargain she could outsmart. He will be emperor. He will kill his mother. She had accomplished the first part with ruthless efficiency. The second part, she realized now, was no longer a distant threat written in the stars. It was a practical possibility being debated, in whispers, in the same corridors where she had once plotted her rise. The architect of ruin had built a structure in which she herself was now the most dangerous remaining pillar. And Nero, impatient, fearful, and increasingly surrounded by those who profited from his worst impulses, was beginning to consider what it would take to remove it. Part 5. The Collapsing Horizon. The palace grew colder, though the brazier still burned. It was not the temperature of the air that changed, but the atmosphere in which words were spoken and silences fell. Servants who had once carried messages freely between Agrippina's apartments and Nero's now found themselves questioned more sharply about their errands. Guards who had once nodded to her with easy respect began to measure their expressions, afraid to be seen as too closely aligned with a woman whose star might, some whispered, be descending. Agrippina felt it in the way conversations stopped when she entered certain rooms, in the way some senators, once eager to seek her counsel, now made polite excuses and melted away rather than be seen too often in her presence. She was not naive. She knew what these small changes meant. Nero was pulling away, not only emotionally, but strategically. He was allowing distance to grow so that if a break came, he would not be dragged down with her. She did not sit still to be erased. At first, she tried to reassert her influence by more conventional means. She criticized some of Nero's new favorites, especially those whose influence seemed to be based more on their ability to amuse him than on any merit in governance. She warned him, sometimes gently, sometimes sharply, that Rome's respect could evaporate quickly if he surrounded himself with flatterers and sycophants. By 59 AD, 4 years into Nero's reign, the relationship between mother and son had deteriorated badly, and ancient sources like Tacitus describe Agrippina openly criticizing Nero's artistic indulgences and the influence of his new circle of Greek companions and performers. An emperor who hears only praise loses the ability to hear warnings, she told him in one conversation that began in calm and ended with both of them brittle. The city will not always be charmed by your lyre. And will it always be charmed by your scowl? He retorted. You speak as if I have learned nothing from you. I have learned too well, perhaps. I know what happens to those who let others hold the reins. She tried other tactics. She cultivated allies among the older aristocracy, hinting, with as much care as possible, that she was still a force to be reckoned with, that those who stood with her might yet find themselves on the right side of history if Nero's rule veered too far into madness. The very act of doing so fed Nero's fears. Whispers reached him of her meetings, of her sharp words about his indulgences. Men eager to protect themselves, or to climb higher in his favor, exaggerated her criticisms, painting her as a schemer who regretted elevating him and now sought to limit or even replace him. Whether she intended any active plot is, in the end, less important than the fact that Nero believed she might. Fear and resentment twisted together inside him like two snakes. He remembered the day the second throne had been moved aside. He remembered the banquet where Britannicus died. He remembered staring into his mother's eyes and seeing that she understood him completely, and that she might one day use that understanding against him. He added to those memories the words she had spoken in anger. I can find another. There was now no other Britannicus to elevate. Nero had seen to that, but the idea that she might back some distant cousin, some governor with a legion at his back, or even stir the city against him through her influence, was enough. The conclusion he came to was, to him, logical. As long as Agrippina lived, his throne was not secure. The idea of killing one's mother is, for most men, a barrier they cannot cross even in thought. But Nero lived in a world where the unnatural had become familiar. He had watched uncles kill cousins, seen wives betray husbands and husbands turn on wives. He had ordered the death of his brother. He inhabited a universe in which blood ties were threads to be cut if they tangled the path to power. Still, matricide was unique. There was a horror attached to it that even Rome, with its long catalogues of cruelty, recognized. It could not be done crudely. It could not look like murder. It must seem like fate, or at least like something other than what it was. Tacitus dates Nero's first attempt on his mother's life to March 59 AD, during festival celebrations for Minerva on the Bay of Naples, when he and his advisors began plotting a maritime accident. He and those around him, men like Anicetus, the commander of the fleet at Misenum, and ambitious courtiers who saw in Agrippina's removal the chance to clear space for their own ascent, began to consider ways in which she might die without his hands or his knives being obviously seen in the act. Anicetus, whose position depended entirely on Nero's favor and who hated Agrippina for her earlier slights against him, proposed a solution that combined engineering and deceit. Tacitus specifically names Anicetus, prefect of the Misenum fleet, as the key architect of the collapsible boat scheme, designed to make Agrippina's death appear as a tragic maritime accident. "There is a way," he said in a quiet chamber, tracing shapes absent-mindedly on the table with one finger. "The sea can be made an accomplice. A pleasure boat, altered, a gift that becomes a coffin." The plan was as grotesque as it was elaborate. A ship would be prepared for Agrippina under the guise of a generous present from an affectionate son. Its hull and superstructure would be modified so that, at a chosen moment, some part of it would collapse, sending its passengers into the sea. The night, the confusion, and the inherent danger of maritime travel could be used to mask the true intention. If she drowned, it could be lamented as a tragic accident. If the ship went down far enough from shore, witnesses would be few, survivors fewer. Nero liked the theatricality of it. There was a perverse artistry in killing by architecture and tide rather than blade. It appealed to the same part of him that loved staging elaborate performances. He could imagine himself, later, speaking in public with tears in his eyes about the cruel irony of losing his mother to the sea. Preparations began. Carpenters and shipwrights were summoned under pretext of outfitting a new vessel for festivals. They were told to build cleverly hidden mechanisms, bolts that could be pulled to release a section of decking, supports designed to fail on command. They were not told why. In an empire that built siege engines and amphitheaters, it was not unthinkable that the emperor might want some new marvel of movable construction. Meanwhile, Nero extended an olive branch to Agrippina. He invited her to the Bay of Naples for the festival of Minerva, framing it as a chance to renew their bond, to show the world that rumors of division between mother and son were false. He would treat her with honor, seat her at his side in public celebrations, display to all that the imperial family remained united. Agrippina was not foolish. She heard the whispers of the city, felt the coolness of her son's regard. The invitation, generous on its surface, came wrapped in too much sweetness. To refuse, however, would be a public admission of fear. It would give Nero an excuse to paint her as deranged, paranoid, ungrateful. She accepted. If she had listened to her own instincts alone, she might have stayed in the safety, such as it was, of her villa and the loyal retainers she still commanded there. But pride is a force as strong as caution. She believed, perhaps, that Nero's need to maintain appearances would protect her in such a public context. She also believed still that she could outthink him. The festival unfolded with all the color and noise that Roman piety and spectacle could summon. Drums, flutes, chants, citizens in garlands, sacrifices at altars wreathed in smoke. Nero moved through it like a man on a stage, basking in the cheers of the crowd, projecting an image of youthful vigor and filial devotion. He embraced Agrippina in view of all, kissed her on the cheek, spoke loudly of her as the woman who had guided his early years. The crowd, ever hungry for signs of harmony among their rulers, applauded. At that night there was a grand banquet in honor of the goddess and in honor of the imperial family's apparent reconciliation. Tables groaned under the weight of food. Wine flowed like a river confined only by the lips of amphorae. Laughter rose, fell, rose again. Nero watched his mother across the room, measuring her movements, her interactions. She seemed composed, her face a mask honed by years of practice. If she suspected, she did not show it. When the hour grew late and the torches along the shore cast their flickering net across the water, Nero approached her with the air of a loving son seeing to his mother's comfort. "You should not ride back by land at this hour," he said. "The roads are dark, and there are too many drunk fools abroad. Let me offer you a safer, more pleasant passage. I have had a boat prepared for you. It is fitted with every luxury." The words were precise, the smile carefully measured. Agrippina hesitated for a fraction of a heartbeat. She thought of the astrologer. She thought of Claudius's mushroom dish. She thought of Britannicus collapsing to the floor while her son watched. Then she pushed the thoughts away. Not because she trusted Nero, but because she refused to be seen as a woman who flinched. "Very well," she said. "I am in your hands." He kissed her forehead. If his lips were cold, the night could be blamed. The boat was a marvel in its way. Lanterns hung from its mast and along its railings, casting a warm glow over polished wood. Cushions were arranged with theatrical care, rich fabrics inviting the weary body to sink into them. Servants waited with wine and delicacies, their eyes trained not on Agrippina, but on their tasks, as if they served not a woman but a role. Agrippina boarded with a small retinue, including her friend and attendant, Acheronia, whose loyalty had been tested by years of proximity to the shifting fortunes of her mistress and never found wanting. As the vessel pushed off from the shore, the music from the banquet faded into a distant echo. The sea took over as the primary sound, its slow, patient slap against the hull, the soft creak of timbers, the muted murmur of men at the oars below decks. Above, the night dome stretched vast and indifferent. Stars looked down, cold witnesses to human schemes. Agrippina reclined on a couch, the motion of the water rocking her with deceptive gentleness. She allowed herself, for a fleeting moment, to imagine that this might simply be what it appeared: a mother, tired from ceremony, being given a luxurious way home by a son eager to display his care. But beneath the cushions, mechanisms waited. At a signal known only to a few, ropes were pulled. The cleverly weakened parts of the superstructure were supposed to fail all at once, sending the deck plummeting into the hold and the people on it into the sea in a chaos from which most would not emerge. What happened instead has been preserved by Tacitus in vivid detail. The ship betrayed its own treachery. The timbers did not collapse cleanly. The engineered failure stuttered, like a bad lie faltering on an unpracticed tongue. Part of the ceiling above the couch gave way, with a hideous cracking sound. Beams and panels crashed down. Acheronia screamed as the structure buckled. Agrippina's couch, by some combination of chance and the way its legs had been placed, absorbed the fall in such a way that it shielded her body. She was pinned, bruised, momentarily stunned, but alive. Water poured in from ruptured planks. Lanterns shattered, sending brief flares of flame skittering across wet surfaces before hissing out. Men shouted in the darkness, their cries mingling with the roar of the sea as it seized its opportunity to invade. Some of the crew, loyal to Nero's instructions, attacked the passengers openly. They tried to push them into the water, to club them into silence. Acheronia, in a moment of panicked calculation, shouted, "I am Agrippina. Save the emperor's mother." It was a fatal mistake. Believing they had identified their target, the assassins turned on her, beating her until she fell, her blood mixing with the black water. Agrippina, nearby but temporarily unnoticed, heard her friend's last cries and understood with a clarity that cut through shock. This was no accident. This was an execution disguised as misfortune. The ship, half crippled, began to list violently. Those who could swim, flung into the sea, thrashed for something to cling to. Those who could not sank quickly, their attempts to scream strangled by salt. Tacitus recounts that Agrippina, remarkably, survived the failed mechanism by swimming nearly 4 miles to shore in the dark, an image that became legendary as the Empress swims. Agrippina forced herself free of the wreckage pinning her. Pain lanced through her limbs, but she bit it down. The instinct to live, honed by exile, by court plots, by every narrow escape of her life, overrode everything else. She threw herself into the water. The sea closed over her like an enormous, uncaring hand. For a terrifying moment, disoriented, she could not tell which way was up. Then her body's memory of movement took over. She kicked, pushed, gasped when her head broke the surface. Around her was chaos, floating debris, flailing figures, the looming, broken outline of the sabotage vessel. She said nothing. She did not call out her name or rank. She knew now that those were targets, not shields. Silently, she swam. Each stroke was a denial of her son's intention, of the prophecy's timetable, of the story others had written for her death. Not yet, she thought, teeth clenched as cold water slapped her face. You do not have me yet. The shore was a dark line in the distance, lit only faintly by the dying glow of lamps from villas and the faraway fire of the ongoing festival. The distance felt immense. Her clothes dragged at her limbs. Waves pulled her sideways, eager to detour her into the wide, anonymous space where bodies disappeared and stories ended. She kept going. An oarsman, perhaps one not privy to the full plan, perhaps someone whose loyalty to his own conscience outweighed his fear, saw a figure moving in the water and rowed toward her. He extended an oar. She seized it with numb fingers. "Who are you?" he hissed, helping haul her onto a piece of floating wreckage. "A stranger," she said hoarsely. "A woman who owes you her life." Even then, even soaked and bruised and coughing up seawater, she lied for survival. The makeshift raft carried her closer to shore, where others, fishermen, villagers, roused by the noise, waded in to help drag wreckage and survivors onto the sand. In the confusion, with night-hiding identities and fear-muffling questions, Agrippina was able to slip away from the cluster of rescuers. She staggered along the beach, every step a clash between pain and stubbornness, until she reached a path she knew well. It led to one of her villas, perched above the bay. Each rise in the path was a small mountain. Each stone underfoot felt like a deliberate test. By the time she reached her door, she was shaking with exhaustion and rage. Her servants, shocked and then horrified as they pieced together what must have happened, wanted to rush to the authorities, to spread the news that the emperor's mother had survived an attempt on her life. She stopped them. "No," she said, voice raw but steady. "You will send a single messenger, to Nero. You will tell him I have been saved, that I await his visit. Nothing more. No accusations, no hysterics." They looked at her as if she were mad, but she understood something they did not. Panic would make her seem weak and unbalanced. Accusations made too soon would make her look like the traitor. If she wanted even a chance to turn this back on him, she had to pretend, for one more round, that she was still willing to believe in accidents. "Tell him," she repeated, "that his mother has escaped the mercy of the sea." The man ran. Agrippina sank onto a couch, her body finally demanding attention. Bruises already darkened her skin. One shoulder burned with the deep ache of a strained joint. But her mind would not rest. In the solitude of that dim room, lit by hastily lit lamps, she allowed herself one moment of raw, unfiltered thought. "My son has tried to kill me." The words were not born of paranoia. They were confirmation. The collapsing boat, the attacking sailors, Aceronia's death, all of it fit together too neatly to be anything else. The prophecy's second sentence had moved from abstract to immediate. She felt no tears. What she felt was a cold, bitter astonishment at the completeness of the circle. She had bargained her life away for his empire when he was an infant, thinking she could control the terms of payment. Now he had called in the debt ahead of schedule. The door burst open some time later as messengers arrived, not from Nero, but ostensibly from concerned officials who had heard of the shipwreck and come to ascertain her condition. Their questions were neutral on the surface, but she could hear the real inquiry beneath. "Are you alive enough to accuse? Are you alive enough to be dangerous?" She smiled thinly. "I have suffered a terrible accident," she said. "The gods saw fit to spare me. I will, in time, resume my life. For now I require rest. Tell the emperor I await his embrace." The men bowed, their eyes darting around the room, looking for any sign that she might be preparing some immediate countermove. Finding none, they withdrew. In the palace, when Nero received the message that Agrippina had survived, his composure cracked. The plan had been supposed to end in drowning, in a neat story of tragedy. Instead, his mother had swum out of the death he had ordered, like some vengeful figure from a myth. A wronged queen rescued from the sea to stalk the dreams of the man who betrayed her. He paced, voice rising, hands shaking. "She lives," he said to those gathered around him. "She lives and she knows. She will not accept this as a simple misfortune. She will talk. She will turn them against me. We have failed." Anicetus, fearing for his own life now that the failure of the ship might be laid at his feet, leaned in with a more brutal suggestion. "The accident did not suffice," he said. "Then we must do what the sea would not. Directly, quickly, before she can rally anyone to her." There was no longer room for subtleties. The logic of fear, once accepted, demands escalation. Nero, torn between dread and a twisted sort of fatalism, agreed. Messengers were dispatched again, this time not in the guise of concerned officials, but as an armed detachment under a pretext so thin it might as well have been transparent. They went to her villa with orders that everyone understood, even if no formal words of execution were written down. Agrippina, hearing the tramp of armed feet approaching through the night, knew. She did not run. There was nowhere to run to. The empire she had helped shape was a net. Its strands reached far beyond the walls of this villa. Any attempt to flee would end in some ditch, some anonymous field, her body found by peasants and given a burial unworthy even of her enemies. No, if she was to die, it would be as herself. She rose, straightened her clothing as much as her bruised body would allow, and stood in the middle of the room. When the door burst open and the centurion stepped inside, sword at his side, flanked by soldiers whose faces were studiously blank, she looked at him with something that was not quite contempt and not quite pity. "So," she said, "the emperor sends his love." The man, unused to such composure, hesitated. He had killed in battle, perhaps, but killing an unarmed woman who stared at him as if he were the one on trial was another matter. I bring word from Caesar," he began, voice faltering. "Spare me the lies," she cut in. "You are not here to speak. You are here to finish what that boat began." He swallowed. For a moment it seemed possible that he might lower his weapon, retreat, refuse. But Rome's machinery was merciless to those who jammed its gears. If he failed, another would be sent, and he would die in her place. She saw the struggle in his eyes and made it easier for him. She stepped forward, grasped the edges of her robe, and pulled it open to bare her abdomen. "Strike here," she said, voice ringing in the small room. "Strike my womb. This is where he came from." Tacitus records Agrippina's famous dying words, "Strike my womb, for there the monster was born," as her final act of defiance, delivered when soldiers reached her villa at Bauli near Misenum in March 59 AD. It was a command, not a plea. For an instant, time held its breath. Then the sword moved. Steel flashed, met flesh. Pain flared white, then red, then began to recede into a vast encompassing dark. Agrippina felt herself falling, not onto the hard floor of the villa, but into a space she had been moving toward ever since a Chaldean astrologer had spoken two phrases over a newborn's crib. "He will be emperor. He will kill his mother." In the last, flickering corner of her awareness, she thought, with a strange mixture of grim amusement and bitterness, that she had indeed bargained correctly. She had traded her life for an emperor. The cost had simply come due in a form more grotesque than even she had dared imagine. Then thought ceased. The architect of ruin lay still. Part 6. The Ghost in the Empire. Word travels through an empire along different roads. Official news moves in scrolls and proclamations, carried by messengers on fast horses, read aloud in forums by heralds with trained voices. Unofficial news moves in whispers and glances, in the tilt of a head and the hush that falls over a room when a certain name is spoken. The official story of Agrippina's death was prepared quickly. Rome heard that the emperor's mother, long afflicted by a restless mind and dangerous ambitions, had been consumed by plots against her own son, that loyal soldiers, investigating her suspected treason, had confronted her in her villa, and in the chaos of her resistance, she had fallen. It was painted as a regrettable necessity, a tragic but unavoidable pruning of a diseased branch from the imperial tree. Tacitus and Suetonius, writing decades later, reject Nero's version outright and describe Agrippina's murder in March 59 AD as a deliberate act of matricide. the first major turning point after which Nero's rule darkened. Now, Nero appeared before the Senate with an expression that hovered between sorrow and gravitas. His speech, crafted with Seneca's reluctant stylus, emphasized his own pain at being forced by duty to act against blood. No son should be compelled to choose between a mother and the safety of Rome, he declared, voice carrying through the chamber. Yet the gods and necessity have placed this bitter chalice in my hands. I drink it for you, for the state, for the future. Some senators stared at the floor as he spoke, not trusting their faces to remain neutral. Others nodded, eager to show support, or at least acceptance. A few, men hardened by decades of seeing beautiful words laid over ugly facts, sat very still, their eyes empty of everything but calculation. Outside the halls of power, the story mutated as it moved. In markets and taverns, the tale of the accident at sea and the mad rebellion in the villa collided with older stories everyone already knew. People remembered that it had been Agrippina who brought Nero back from the edge of obscurity, who had stood beside Claudius, who had secured grain, soothed panics, navigated transitions. They remembered, too, that Britannicus had fallen at a banquet, and that Claudius's death had been convenient. A pattern suggested itself to those who liked such things. Some drew one conclusion. The mother had been the mastermind all along, and now she had finally been justly removed by the son she created. Others drew the opposite. The son had turned on his own maker. If a man can do that, what hope does anyone else have? The truth lay somewhere in the contorted middle, but truth has little market value once stories have taken hold. What no public proclamation described, what no official speech admitted, was the effect the act had on Nero himself. There is a moment after a horrific deed when the world continues as if nothing has changed. The sun rises, servants bring breakfast, dogs bark. The city churns through its routines because it cannot afford to stop every time a single life is extinguished, no matter how important that life was. Nero woke on the morning after Agrippina's murder to the same sounds he had heard every day of his imperial life. The rustle of silk as attendants moved through the room, the soft clink of a basin being set on a table, the murmur of voices outside the door. But the noise in his own head was different. Later anecdotes preserved by Suetonius claim Nero was haunted by visions of his mother after 59 AD, consulting magicians and performing rituals to appease her spirit, a detail that suggests even official propaganda could not fully silence his private guilt. Sleep had come only in snatches. Whenever he closed his eyes fully, he saw the sea, black, swallowing light, and a woman's head breaking the surface, hair soaked, eyes burning with recognition. He saw the room in the villa, the lamplight glinting off a sword, the pale curve of a hand as it pulled back a robe. He was not there, of course. He had not personally witnessed the final blow, but imagination filled the gaps easily enough. Every sound in the corridor outside his chamber might be the tread of a ghost. Every creak of wood might be the couch on the sabotaged ship splintering again. For the first time in his life, he understood something Agrippina had always known. Power is not merely freedom, it is also a mirror that never lets you look away from what you have done to keep it. He tried to drown the images in activity. He threw himself into public duties with a manic energy that surprised even those accustomed to his flair for performance. He attended meetings of the Senate, sat in judgment on court cases, signed decrees with a flourish that bordered on the theatrical. He organized games, announced building projects, spoke of his plans for the city with visionary enthusiasm. He talked more often than before of art and beauty, of a new Rome that would not just conquer lands but captivate souls. At night the mask slipped. In darkened rooms, among a smaller circle of intimates chosen for their capacity to flatter rather than to criticize, his bravado turned brittle. He drank more heavily. He demanded music late into the hours when most of the city slept. He alternated between hysterical laughter and sullen silence, staring into corners as if expecting someone to step out of the shadows. Once, in a particularly unguarded moment, he muttered loud enough for those near him to hear, "They say I have killed a mother. The truth is worse. I have killed whatever was left of the boy she made." None of them answered. To contradict him would be dangerous. To agree would be suicidal. They responded instead with an outpouring of praise, assurances that he had done what any strong ruler must, that he had freed himself from a tyrannical matron, that history would see him as a liberator, not a parasite. History, like the sea, is indifferent to such protests. Outside Nero's skull, the empire moved through its own adjustments. Those who had depended on Agrippina's patronage scrambled to realign themselves. Some retired quietly, citing age or ill health, rather than risk a misstep in a court now ruled solely by a man whose impulses were less predictable. Others rushed to prove their loyalty to Nero by denouncing the dead woman they had once flattered. Seneca and Burrus found themselves in a precarious position. They had worked closely with Agrippina. Without her, their paths to influence would have been much steeper. Yet they had also become, in time, the advocates for Nero's growing independence. They had, knowingly or not, helped move him down the path that led to this act. Now they stood between an emperor whose guilt had curdled into volatility and a Senate that watched, increasingly alarmed, as the young man's decisions became more self-indulgent, more erratic. Burrus died in 62 AD, and Seneca's influence waned as Nero turned to new advisors like Tigellinus, marking the end of the relatively restrained early reign. Seneca tried to steer Nero back towards some semblance of virtue, penning letters and dialogues on mercy, on the proper use of anger, on the transient nature of earthly power. His words landed differently now. Before, Nero had seen in them a guidebook for rulership. Now some part of him heard them as veiled reproaches. "Do you think I do not know what I have done?" he snapped at the philosopher once, when Seneca's counsel on clemency leaned too close to an implied criticism of recent actions. "Do you think these pretty phrases can unspill blood? If you wanted me to be a different man, you should have trained a different boy." Seneca, stung but outwardly serene, retreated into the only armor he had, the conviction that reason eventually must prevail. Burrus took a more pragmatic view. He focused on maintaining discipline within the guard, ensuring that their loyalty to Nero remained primary. He understood that if the soldiers wavered, no amount of rhetoric would save the regime. Both men knew in their private thoughts that something had cracked in the core of the man they served. They simply had no way to mend it. In the smoky corners of taverns, in the markets where storytellers earned a few coins by weaving morality into gossip, Agrippina's image began to shift into something larger than life. Some painted her as a monster whose ambition had finally devoured her, a warning to women who dared to reach too high. They spoke of her incestuous marriage to Claudius, of her rumored poisonings, of her iron will. They described her as a spider at the center of a web that had ensnared Rome itself. Others, especially women who had watched their own agency crushed by fathers, husbands, and brothers, found a different emphasis. They told the story of a woman born into a world that denied her formal power, but who refused to accept that denial. They recounted her journey from exile to the palace, from widowhood to the bed of an emperor, from marginal figure to effective co-ruler. Modern historians recognize that while ancient sources like Tacitus are often hostile toward Agrippina, portraying her through a misogynistic lens, she demonstrably wielded extraordinary informal power in a political system that excluded women from formal office. The most haunting version of her story, though, was the one that fused both views. In that telling, Agrippina was both villain and victim, both architect and casualty. She was the mother who had crafted a ruler so well that he became too dangerous to everyone, including herself. She was the embodiment of a paradox, the woman who had most fully grasped the mechanics of Roman power and who had been destroyed by those same mechanics made flesh in her son. Children in later years would be frightened into obedience with half-remembered versions of her last command. "Strike my womb," their elders would whisper dramatically. That is where he came from. Nero, hearing such tales in fragments, would feel as though the walls themselves were murmuring accusations. He had tried to erase her. Instead, he had turned her into a legend that clung to his own name, like a shadow that never shrank, no matter how brightly he lit the stage. As time passed, Nero's rule followed the arc that those who had watched him up close could have predicted, though perhaps not with such horrific flourish. The Great Fire of Rome in July 64 AD became a defining crisis. Nero was blamed by rumor for starting it, charges modern scholars largely dismiss, and his response, rebuilding in marble while persecuting Christians as scapegoats, cemented his image as tyrant. The tension within him between artist and autocrat, between the boy who loved performance and the man who had killed to keep his crown, resolved itself in ways that magnified the worst tendencies of both. He staged lavish spectacles in which he himself took center stage, singing, acting, playing the lyre, demanding from his subjects not only obedience, but applause. To question his talent was to question the emperor. To leave the theater before he finished was to court suspicion. He spent money with abandon, funding grandiose projects and indulgent entertainments. The city glittered, but beneath the shine, debts accumulated. New taxes were levied. Old corruption flourished in the shadow of his distractions. He trusted flatterers and sycophants more than counselors who dared speak hard truths. Seneca, sensing his influence waning and his presence growing more dangerous than useful, eventually withdrew. Burrus died, leaving the guard in the hands of men more pliant to Nero's whims. In moments of crisis, such as the Great Fire that consumed vast tracts of Rome, Nero's responses mixed genuine attempts at relief with self-aggrandizing gestures that eroded what was left of his credibility. When the city burned, rumors that he had ordered the blaze, or at least welcomed it for the chance to rebuild in his own image, spread like smoke. To deflect blame, he turned on convenient targets, persecuting communities whose foreign customs made them easy scapegoats. The longer he ruled, the more people whispered that there was something fundamentally broken in him, something that had snapped the night his mother died and never reset. Nero was declared a public enemy by the Senate and committed suicide in 68 AD after a failed rebellion, ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty that Agrippina had done so much to sustain and shape. He became, in the eyes of many, not only a tyrant, but an unmoored one, a man adrift between guilt and grandiosity, haunted by a crime he could neither fully own nor fully escape. If he ever thought back explicitly to the prophecy, the one spoken in that long-ago room over his crib, there is no record of it. But his every action after Agrippina's death seemed to walk in tandem with its logic. He had done what the stars said he would. The act had not freed him. It had chained him to a version of himself he could neither respect nor forgive. And what of Agrippina? Now that she no longer drew breath, no longer moved through corridors or bent senators to her will. The flesh decays, the name remains. Agrippina the Younger, born 15 AD, died 59 AD, remains one of Roman history's most formidable women. Daughter of Germanicus, sister of Caligula, wife of Claudius, mother of Nero, positioned at the very heart of the Julio-Claudian dynasty's rise and catastrophic collapse. In the annals of those who wrote history with more ink than sympathy, she became a convenient repository for all the anxieties Rome had about powerful women. Tacitus and Suetonius cataloged her suspected crimes with relish: the poisoning of Claudius, the scheming against Britannicus, the incestuous overtones of her marriage, the arrogance of her seating by Nero's throne. They framed her as a warning: let this be the fate of women who usurp the roles of men. Yet even as they condemned, they could not help but admire. They wrote, sometimes grudgingly, of her intelligence, her resolution, her ability to navigate an arena that had not been built for her. They acknowledged that in a world where women were expected to be ornamental or compliant, she had been neither. Later generations reading these accounts would argue over her in ways that would have amused her had she lived to hear them. Was she a monster? A proto-feminist? A tragic figure undone by her own overreach? A product of a monstrously warped environment that rewarded cruelty and punished vulnerability? The answer, unsatisfying to those who prefer simple categories, is that she was all of these and more. She was a girl who saw her mother starved by a distant emperor and learned that tears are useless against hunger enforced by decree. She was a sister who watched her brother's madness end in assassination and exile. She was an exile herself, who clawed her way back from the edges of irrelevance by using every tool at her disposal: beauty, lineage, intellect, patience. She was a wife who married her uncle not for love, but for position. A mother who raised a son not simply to survive in a brutal world, but to master it so completely that no one could ever threaten him as others had threatened her. She was also the woman who, in making that son into a weapon, forgot that weapons are not loyal. They are wielded by whoever holds the hilt strongest at the moment, and sometimes they turn in the hand. In the end, the central irony of her life is the one that gives her story its enduring power. Agrippina did not want power for its own sake. She wanted it through a vessel, through Nero, because that was the only avenue the structures of her world allowed her. She poured herself into him, into his education, his image, his ascent, believing that by controlling the creature she created, she could control the world. Despite the bias of her ancient biographers, most modern scholars agree Agrippina achieved what few women in Roman history could. She shaped imperial succession, policy, and propaganda from positions of informal power, making her both creator and victim of Nero's reign. She succeeded in the first part beyond any reasonable expectation. A boy who might have remained a minor figure in history became emperor of Rome largely because of her. The second part, that she could rule through him indefinitely, proved to be her fatal miscalculation. The tragedy that follows is not simply that he killed her, but that in doing so, he also annihilated the last barrier between his own impulses and absolute unchecked power. The empire suffered for it. So did he. Even as his reign continued, even as new scandals and horrors piled atop the old, some Romans would look back to the years when Agrippina had sat beside Claudius, when she had maneuvered Nero into place, when her iron will had kept at least some of the worst possibilities at bay, and they would ask themselves in guarded tones, was Rome safer when the spider sat in the web? It is a question that has no comfortable answer. In a quiet, fictional moment that history cannot record but imagination can supply, one might picture the Bay of Naples many years after both mother and son have turned to dust. The water is still. The shoreline villas have new owners. Children play where once soldiers marched. The sea, tireless, continues its work of erosion and renewal, indifferent to the names carved on stone above it. A fisherman casting his net as his father did, and his father before him, may look out at the glittering surface and recall a story his grandfather told him once, when he was small. Of a night when a boat broke apart under a velvet sky, of a woman who swam silent through black water, of soldiers sent to finish what the sea could not. He may not remember her name. It will have blurred in the telling, mixed with other tales of queens and curses and the strange, terrible bargains people make with their own children. But somewhere in the city, in the brittle pages of histories, in the echoes of theater lines and whispered bedtime warnings, the outline of her remains. A woman stands in a dim room, holding a baby, listening to an astrologer. He will be emperor, the man says. He will kill his mother. Her reply, clear and unwavering, crosses centuries like a thrown spear. Let him kill me, she says, provided he rules. The sea goes on breathing. Rome goes on dreaming. And Agrippina the Younger, sister, wife, mother of emperors, and in some ways more imperial than any of them, remains suspended forever in that moment of acceptance, the architect of her own ruin and of the ruin her creation would one day bring to the house she spent her life defending. The end.